Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are continuing the journey into the wonderful world of watercolors. Today's episode delves deep into the technical aspects of watercolor painting. As the title suggests, this video is primarily intended for beginners. As for others who want to enjoy seeing a painting being done, fast forward to the last chapter of this video. This video is the first part of a two-part series on watercolor painting fundamentals. In this video, we briefly touch upon certain concepts that are imperative to add depth and dimension to your painting. I will demonstrate and explain the usual mistakes that absolute beginners usually make. This video will help you to take your paintings from here to a more realistic and captivating artwork. Finally, I will put all the concepts that we have discussed today into a painting so that you can have a better practical understanding of the concepts that we have discussed, thereby enabling you to create more realistic and fascinating landscapes. Hi, I'm Bipin. Follow me on my journey from a piece of paper to an awesome piece of art. Let's start from an absolute beginner level. The first thing that is required to make a good watercolor painting is a 300 GSM watercolor paper. GSM stands for grams per square meter. The GSM value is an indication of paper's weight. 300 GSM is the perfect choice as it's ideal for washes and layering that plays a significant role in watercolor painting. Next, you must have good brushes to paint. Today, there are a lot of synthetic brushes available that are cheaper and get your work done in a decent fashion. I recommend you to have a rigger brush to draw twigs, branches and grass. Flat brushes are mostly used for washes. End of the day, it's your personal preference. Round brush is an all-rounder. You can use for washes to create tree trunks, branches, mountains. You can use it in a wide variety of ways. The last thing you must have is an artist-grade watercolor from your preferred brand. These colors are known for superior quality and vibrant colors. They have better pigmentation, consistency and transparency, though it might cost you a bit. Now that you have these basic requirements, let's start painting. Absolute beginners have a tendency to paint like they paint using crayons and sketch pencils. They do not mix colors. They paint colors as such and have a general tendency to go for symmetry, which you can seldom find in nature. Usage of black for shadows is another beginner mistake. Don't ever use black in watercolor paintings. Being a transparent medium, usage of opaque colors like white and black are considered sacrilege. Watercolors are mostly transparent in nature, so ideally, it's always preferable to work from background to foreground. Absolute beginners tend to do it the other way, painting background after the foreground. Now, let's move on to the next level of beginners. They have some info regarding light and shade, specifically highlights and shadows. They can do a graded wash of the sky like I do in this video. For the uninitiated, graded wash is the one in which the wash gets lighter as you apply the wash from top to bottom. The color is toned down after each wash by diluting paint with more water. Let's continue with the example of the tree. Here, few strokes of sap green is used to represent the highlight of the foliage. Viridian green is used to represent the midtones. The foliage and trunk are almost symmetrical. Always remember to make unsymmetrical shapes when it comes to nature. Avoid symmetry. Let's fix the beginner mistakes, especially when painting a tree. A tree is a solid object with height, width, and depth. Hence, foliage and tree trunk must have a sense of three-dimensionality. To understand this better, consider foliage as a green sphere or a tennis ball. Here, I mixed sap green with a tinge of lemon yellow to represent the highlights of the foliage. Cobalt blue and viridian green are mixed to replicate the midtones. Now I add crimson to the mix to represent core shadows of the foliage. The light source is supposed to be at the top right point of the sphere. Obviously, light will cast shadow of the sphere. The colors used for the core shadow is used again to depict the cast shadow. This concept we discussed in a hypothetical sphere can be applied in a real life scenario. To start with, I wet the paper with clean water. This is the wet on wet technique. When the paper is still wet, start the graded wash. I am using cobalt blue for the sky and number 12 round brush for the wash. I mixed burnt sienna with a bit of vermilion red to get that earthly touch I desire. Once the paper is completely dry, few unconventional strokes of sap green is applied on paper to represent the highlights of the foliage. Viridian green and cobalt blue mixture will represent the midtones as it was previously demonstrated with the sphere. The core shadow comes into play with the strokes of viridian green, cobalt blue and crimson mixture. Let's paint the tree trunk. I let in a mix of burnt sienna and yellow ochre onto the paper for tree trunk. The mixture used to depict the core shadow is again used for the shadow of the tree trunk. It's imperative to note that the branches of a tree taper towards the end. Beginners are always found to be drawing branches without tapering. Now I am using rigger brush to draw the twigs. Let's draw some grass underneath the tree. Of course, there is the cast shadow. Always remember that we live in a 3D world. However, the paper is a two-dimensional object. To incorporate the depth in a 3D world, we create an illusion of depth in a painting. A flat painting looks dull and lifeless. However, a good painting will have the illusion of depth and perspective. Perspective is the art of representing solid objects on a two-dimensional surface so as to give the right impression of their height, width, depth and position in relation to each other when viewed from a particular point. Artists use different techniques to represent space and depth, creating a sense of three-dimensionality. One of the commonly employed technique is linear perspective to create the illusion of depth and distance. This technique uses lines converging at vanishing points on the horizon line. Based on the number of vanishing points used, this technique is classified into three. One-point perspective. It employs a single vanishing point on the horizon line. It often depicts objects or scenes that are facing the viewer. Two-point perspective. It uses two vanishing points on the horizon line, allowing for a greater sense of depth and perspective. Three-point perspective. This technique involves the use of three vanishing points. Here one vanishing point can be above or below the horizon line. It is often used in depiction of superhero characters and on scenes that demand extreme angles like high or low vantage point. Now it's time to discuss the color perspective. Color perspective in art is the process of employing colors to create the illusion of depth and distance. Warm versus cool colors. Warm colors like red, lemon yellow, burnt sienna tend to come forward. Cool colors like cobalt blue, viridian green and crimson tend to recede. If these colors are employed correctly, it will create the impression of distance and depth in a painting. Saturation. High saturated colors appear more vibrant and in close proximity. They can create an impression that the object is near to the viewer. The less saturated colors tend to be muted and will recede into the distance. Bleeding and sharp edges. Bleeding edges implies distance. Sharp edges implies proximity. They are found to be of great help to imply distance and depth. To sum it up, color perspective is essentially a technique that effectively employs psychological and physical effects of color to create the illusion of depth and three-dimensionality in a two-dimensional medium. Now, I'm gonna create a landscape painting that will incorporate all the topics that we have covered. I am using 300 GSM hard textured paper. You can use any 300 GSM paper of your choice. It's your personal preference. I start off with the wet and wet technique by wetting paper with clean water. I use number 20 round brush for this. With the same brush, I apply a wash of cerulean blue for the sky. Let the paper dry a bit. Then apply lighter shade of grey when the paper is wet enough to bleed. Here I am using the tissue paper to employ the technique of lifting. If you wish to see me doing a video on lifting, please leave a comment. The greys are obtained by mixing cobalt blue and burnt sienna. Now I am creating a mountain that's more nearer. Hence the edges are sharp. The colors are more saturated and vibrant. Now I dab the paper with water to create bleeding and sharp edges. A muted shade of viridian green and cobalt blue is applied. Let the paper dry completely. Pine trees are added to give life to the distant landscape. For those of you who wanted to know how to paint a pine tree, this demo is for you. Let's grab a round brush. First, draw a line vertically, then move the brush from left to right randomly as I show in the video. The size of brush strokes increases in size as we come down to the bottom of the tree. Then I add more darker color of green to convey midtones and shadows. Now let's move back to the demonstration. I'm wetting the paper with clean water using my number 20 round brush. I'm letting in the mix of sap green and lemon yellow to create the meadows. Now I apply more saturated green in the bottom right corner. During the recording of this video, certain unwanted incidents occurred. For my viewers' understanding, I want you to know that it's a one-man show. I'm placing the camera and then I'm painting. So sometimes I cover the lens so much so that the demonstration is lost to the silhouette of my torso. I apologize for that. I wish to have more depth in pine trees, so I am painting more pine trees with muted green colors. Finally, the tree. I am using unconventional strokes of sap green to represent the highlights of the foliage. I am using the same colors, same technique to paint the left tree. Much like I demonstrated earlier, I am using cobalt blue and viridian green to convey the midtones. In between, I am adding a tinge of burnt sienna. The idea is to get different hues of green. Now for depicting core shadow, crimson is added to the mix of cobalt blue and viridian green. Now let's paint a happy little tree on the right side. Same technique, same colors are used on this tree. Let's add a tree trunk. I toned down the paint a bit using yellow ochre as I felt the first stroke was more aggressive and loud. Now this one seems perfect. I am resorting to lifting using the tissue paper as I am not happy with the outcome. I add few more details on the left tree. Adding few grasses here and there will give more dimension to the scene. The grasses below the tree are deliberately made darker as they are inside the cast shadows of the tree. The grasses themselves cast shadows on the ground. These shadows are more darker and sharper owing to their proximity to the ground. Now adding some flowers to spice up the scene. Let's focus on the guy with his pet dog. Since the painting is more realistic in nature, the figures are more detailed than in my usual paintings. wetting paper again to lay the colors of a tarred road. I am being extra cautious here as I don't want my stroke to trespass into the meadows. We have reached the final phase of demonstration. I am using number 2 fan brush to add some fine irregular details of leaves. I am placing some grasses in the meadows using fan brush. Using my rigger brush to depict the cast shadows of grasses. Finally, the pet dog. It's a domesticated, lovely dog, and it came off well in the painting. Now it's time for me to sign off the painting. Last but not the least, few birds will add more life to the scene. I hope you liked my demonstration and the concepts that I have taught you today. Leave me a comment to share your thoughts and suggestions. Now it's your turn to paint. I hope by now you would have had better understanding of ways to add depth and dimension to your paintings. I believe you would have found new ways to make your painting more realistic and captivating. If you found my video to be informative and interesting, hit the like button for this video. If you don't want to miss my future videos, consider subscribing to my channel and hit the bell icon. Thank you for joining me today. Happy painting. Hope you had a great time watching me playing with colors. I will be back soon with a new painting. Till then, it's me Pipin signing off.